Before you embark on your learning journey, it's a good idea to learn how you can navigate through the course interface and make the best use of the available features. When you access a module, you'll first view the landing page, which displays its title and the content structure. You can begin the module by clicking the Start Module button. This takes you to the first lesson. You can also view the content structure for each module in the left panel. Each module is divided into sections, and each section consists of lessons. You can also navigate to any lesson by clicking the lesson title in the menu. Note that you can go through the lessons in any order, and you can revisit them at any point. Keep in mind that to complete a lesson, you must scroll all the way down until you see the button that indicates the title of the next lesson. You can check your progress of the module at 2 levels. If you're looking for a specific topic, you can use the search feature. Videos are played using a custom smart player, which provides several features. The Captions button enables you to switch off or display the captions in one of the available languages. You can also customize the way captions are displayed by clicking on the caption settings. From here, you can increase or decrease the font size of the captions and even choose between different colors and transparency levels for the caption's text and background. If you prefer a faster or slower playback speed, you can change it in player settings. To navigate to other modules in the course, you click the Previous or Next buttons. You can also click the View Full Path button to view all of the modules available in the course. To complete a course, you must complete all of the modules that are marked Required. You're now ready to expand your learning horizons at UiPath Academy. Happy learning!
Hello and welcome to RPA Developer Production Ready Essentials training. In this video, we'll cover creating variables in UiPath Studio and using them to pass information between activities. We'll create a workflow that asks for input from the user and saves the answer to a string variable, then assigns a value to another string variable and logs a message with the 2 values. Let's start by adding a new sequence activity. Since RPA projects can get quite complex and are often collaborative, it's a good practice to give descriptive names to activities and add annotations. Let's rename it Demo Sequence. We can create annotations for any activity by right-clicking on it, selecting Annotations and Add Annotation. Let's pin the annotation so that it'll be visible. Next, let's add an input dialog activity. This activity displays a dialog box that prompts the user with a label message and an input field, and then saves the user's input to a variable. Let's set the title of the input dialog to Username. Now let's specify the information that we want to obtain from the user in the Label Input field. In the Activities Properties panel, we can see that there is a Result Output property. This is where we'll specify the variable to which we want to save the user's input. But in order to do this, we need to create a variable first. Now there are 2 main ways to create a new variable in UiPath Studio: from the Variables panel by adding a new line, or from the Activity Properties field and by pressing Ctrl+K in an input field that requires a variable name. Let's use the Variables panel to create a new type string variable called username. First, enter the name of the variable. It's a good practice to use camel case and enter a descriptive name for the variable. Next, let's choose the type. We can select one of the types shown in the drop-down menu, but we can also click Browse and select a .NET type from the window that's displayed. For example, dictionary property. In our case, we have a string variable. The scope input field determines the containers in which the variable is available. The default value sets an initial value for the variable when the workflow is started. Now we want to print the value entered by the user. Several activities enable us to do that: message box, write line, or log message. Let's use log message and enter the username variable in the message property of the activity. This activity writes the specified diagnostic message at the selected level, in this case, info. The messages are stored in the output panel and also logged for future use. Let's save and run the workflow. We'll enter a value in the input dialog. So far, so good. Now let's check the output panel. Great! We can see the value we've entered in the output panel. Next, we'll have a look at creating variables using the Ctrl+K method, using the assign activity, how variable scopes work, and concatenating strings. As mentioned earlier, each variable has a scope. In this case, the scope is demo sequence. For demonstration purposes, let's create a new sequence inside our sequence and call it assign sequence. Let's add an assign activity to the new sequence. The assign activity allocates any value that we set to a variable or argument. All you need to do is enter the variable in the to field and the value or expression in the value field. But before we can assign a value, we need to create the variable. Let's click the to field of the assign activity and press Ctrl+K. Let's name the variable status and press enter. Next, we'll give a value to this variable using the assign activity. For this example, let's enter is logged in the value input field. When we create a variable using this method, the type of the variable will often be generic value, and the scope will be set to the container which includes it. In our case, assign sequence. Let's change the type of the variable to string. Next, we can change the message from the log message activity to a concatenation of the strings in the two variables. The concatenation is obtained by using the VB.NET operators plus or ampersand. But it looks like we've run into some trouble. The scope of the variable status is assign sequence, so the variable is not declared outside of this sequence. In order to use it, we need to change the scope of the variable to demo sequence. Note that the compilation error has disappeared. Now that we've demonstrated how scopes work, let's remove the unnecessary sequence assign. Now let's run again and check the message in the output panel. And it looks good. Thank you for watching this tutorial. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to the RPA Developer Production Ready Essentials training. In this video, we'll cover working with array variables. An array is a type of variable which lets you store multiple values of the same type. UiPath Studio supports as many types of arrays as types of variables. This means that you can create an array of numbers, of strings, of images, of Boolean values, and so on. Arrays are useful in a lot of real-life scenarios where we need to store multiple values of the same type. For example, let's say that we need to store 100 different strings that will need to be added to different emails. It's easier to use specific strings from an array for the designated emails. Now, let's see arrays in action. In this demonstration, we'll create an array of strings, initialize it, add 2 values, modify, and display it. Let's start by adding an assign activity and defining a new array variable by pressing Ctrl+K in the toInput field. Let's call it string array. Now let's open the variables panel and change the type of our variable to an array of strings by choosing array of type, with type being a string. Next, we'll initialize the array in the default input field by adding new string, open brackets, close brackets, open curly braces, close curly braces, to create an object, a concrete instance of the string class. Next, we want to add 2 elements to our array. Let's enter 2 strings in the value input field of the assign activity. Let's also make sure that we rename our assign activity and use an annotation for descriptive purposes. We've created our array of strings and added 2 values. Now let's display it. To do this, we'll use a log message activity. To display our array of strings, we're going to use string concatenation to get the information from each index, separated by a space. Each element in an array has an index number by which it can be referenced. The index of the first array element is 0. Let's run the process and see the result. Great! We can see the elements of the array in the output panel, separated by a space. But what if we want to change the value of an element in an array? Let's see how we can modify the first element from John to Jane. To do that, we'll add another assign activity and use the toInput field to access the element at index 0. Then, let's enter Jane in the value field to modify the element. We'll make sure to rename the activity and add an annotation. Let's display our modified array by using a new log message activity. This time, we'll use a string.join method, which we'll also display by adding a space between the elements. Let's run the workflow. As you can see in the output panel, now we have the first message with the original values of the array and the second message with the modified ones. And that concludes our demo. Thank you for watching this tutorial. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to RPA Developer Production Ready Essentials training. In this video, we will cover using if statements in UiPath Studio. The activities inside workflows are generally executed from top to bottom, in the order that they appear or according to the arrows in the flowchart. Control flow activities, however, break up the flow of execution by employing decision-making, looping, and branching, thus enabling your process to conditionally execute certain blocks of activities. In this lesson, we'll learn about the if activity, which is used in sequences, the flow decision activity, the equivalent of the if activity, which is used in flowcharts, and the VB if operator. They enable your workflow to take one of two different courses of action, depending on whether a specified condition is met or not. For this demonstration, consider the following business scenario. For reporting purposes, we need to find out if the reporting year is a leap year or not. Let's start with the logic. A year is a leap year if it meets the following conditions. The year is evenly divisible by 4. If the year can be evenly divided by 100, it is not a leap year, unless the year is also evenly divisible by 400. As for the workflow design, we'll build a simple project that asks the user for a year, checks if the conditions are met, and then prints a message to indicate if it's a leap year or not. Let's see how we can use an if activity in a sequence workflow. We'll add a sequence. Name it leap year sequence and add an annotation for it as well. Next, we'll add an input dialog activity that we'll use to get the year from the user. Let's fill in the input properties for the activity. Now let's create an int32 variable and add it to the result field of the input dialog. Next, let's add an if activity to our workflow. Now this activity contains 3 sections: condition, then, and else. The condition field needs to contain a Boolean expression based on which either the then section or the else section is executed. Remember the conditions we've mentioned earlier. A leap year is evenly divisible by 4, but if it is evenly divisible by 100, it also needs to be divisible by 400. This is the VB.NET expression that we need to use to set the conditions. In UiPath workflows, we use VB.NET syntax. Check the link below the video for more information regarding expressions in VB.NET. Now that we've entered the expression in the condition field of the if activity, we'll add 2 message box activities. One on the then branch with the message "it is a leap year," and another one on the else branch with the message "it is not a leap year." Let's save the workflow, run it, and test with a few values. And that looks good. For the next step, let's develop a workflow with the same logic, but instead of a sequence, we'll use a flowchart. We'll click New Flowchart in the ribbon menu. We'll name it Leap Year Flowchart and add an annotation as well. Let's copy the input dialog activity from the previous workflow and set it as a start node. This will make it the first activity to run in the workflow. Now let's define the variable year of type int32. Next, we'll add a flow decision activity. Connect the input dialog activity to it and enter the same expression as in the previous workflow in the condition field. Now, let's add the 2 message boxes and connect them to the true and false branches of the flow decision. And it's time to run the workflow and see what we've got. Great! We just solved the same business scenario using the same logic, but 2 types of workflows. In practice, because sequences have a simple linear representation that flows from top to bottom, they are best suited for simple scenarios, when activities follow each other. As a general guideline, avoid using sequences when you need to include multiple nested if statements. Flowcharts are best suited for showcasing important decision points within a process. A sequence would do just fine to solve this scenario. Now that we've seen how to use the if and flow decision activities, there's one more tip that we want to share. The VB if operator can be very useful for minor local conditions or data computing, and it can sometimes reduce a whole block to a single activity. Let's create a new sequence and use the VB if operator to solve the same business case. We'll name it leap year sequence and add an annotation. We'll copy the input dialog activity, create the year variable, and also a new variable called message of type string. Next, add an assign activity. Enter this expression in the value field, and enter the message variable in the to field. Finally, add a message box activity and enter the message variable in the text property. And let's run it again. Great! And that was all for this lesson. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to this tutorial on using loops in UiPath Studio. Loops are control structures which repeat a set of instructions based on a condition. In practice, loops are used to automate repetitive tasks. For example, checking a list of emails for attachments, extracting information from a list of invoices, transferring a set of customer profiles from Excel to a CRM application, and so on. In flowcharts, the simplest types of loops can be created by connecting a certain point in our workflow to an earlier execution point. In sequences, there are special activities or containers that repeat the action that is inside the body section, based on a condition. In this demonstration, we'll see how we can use the do-while loop in sequence and flowchart projects. The while and do-while loops work by repeating a given set of actions from the body while the specified condition is true. The only difference between the two is the order in which the two elements are executed. The while loop checks the condition first, and if it's true, executes the set of actions in the body. On the other hand, the do-while loop executes the actions, then checks the condition, and, if true, executes the activities again. Remember the example that we've used in the if statements lesson? Let's turn it into a repetitive process. We'll build a sequence workflow that asks for a year and checks if it's a leap year. If it's not, it displays a message and then asks for another year. Once it gets a year that is a leap year, it prompts the user, exits the loop, and stops. Okay, ready? Let's see how we can use a do-while loop in a sequence project. Start by adding a do-while activity and copying the activities inside the do container. For the condition of the loop, we need to think for how long we want to repeat the leap year check, and that is as long as the year provided by the user is not a leap year. We'll use the following expression for this. And let's run the workflow. Try a few years. And it works. What about creating a do-while loop in a flowchart? Well, that's easy too. Let's look at the flowchart workflow from the previous exercise. The only change that we need to make is to drag an arrow from the message box, not a leap year, to the input dialog activity, and this creates the loop. Let's run the workflow and see what happens. It looks great. And this concludes our tutorial on the while and do-while loops. Watch the next video to learn about the for each loop. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to the second part of this tutorial on using loops. In this scenario, we'll focus on how to use the for each loop in UiPath Studio. The for each activity works by iterating through a list of items, one item at a time, and executing whatever actions are in the body of the activity. Let's see it in action. We have the following business scenario. The PDF files from a given folder need to be renamed so that the file name ends with the current date. To solve this scenario, we'll create a workflow that asks us what folder we want to process, then, for each file in the folder, saves the name to a variable, adds the current date to the value, then prints it in the output panel and changes the name of the file. Let's get started. We'll create a new sequence, name it Rename Invoices, and add an annotation. We'll add a select folder activity in order to let the user choose the folder which will be processed. This activity opens a dialog box, prompting the user to select a folder and saves the input to a string variable. Let's create a variable for the output and rename it Folder Path. Next, we want to get the file names and store them in an array variable. Let's create an array of strings variable and name it Invoices Array. Now, let's drag an assign activity. We'll name it Assign Invoices Array. We'll use this activity to get the file names from the folder and store them in Invoices Array. To do this, we'll enter Invoices Array in the toInput field and use the directory .getFile vb.net method. Now we want to loop through the elements of the array. For each element, we want to add the date to the name, log the result, and then change the name of the file in the folder. Let's start by adding a for-each activity. The first thing that you need to do when using a for-each activity is change the type argument from object to the specific one that you will use, in our case, string. Next, we'll enter the name of our array variable in the input field and change the item to file name. Now, let's add an assign activity. We'll use this activity to change the names of the elements in the array and store them. But before we can do that, we need to create a new variable of type string. Let's call it new file name. Let's give the assign activity a descriptive name and add our new variable to it. To modify the values, we'll use the replace now and toString vb.net methods. This expression will add the date at the end of the file name. Let's use a log message activity to display the new file name in the output panel. And finally, let's rename the file by using the moveFile activity. This activity moves a file from a specified location to another. In our case, the path is the different file name. Let's give the activity a descriptive name. Next, we'll enter file name to the path input field and new file name to the destination input field. Let's save and run the workflow. You can see the new file names are logged in the output panel, and here they are in the folder too. And this concludes our lesson on the for each loop. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Hello and welcome back. In this tutorial, we'll learn about using the switch activity in our workflows. Switch allows us to select one choice out of multiple based on the value of a specified expression. The switch activity can be useful when categorizing data according to a custom number of cases. For example, storing data in multiple spreadsheets or sorting through names of employees. Let's consider the following case. We have the Invoices folder that contains invoices for the last 4 years. We want to sort the invoices in different folders, one for each year. The year is written as the last 4 digits in the file name. To solve this scenario, we'll create a workflow that gets all the files from the folder, loops through the files using a for each activity, checks the last 4 characters of the file name, and moves the files according to them. Let's do this. First, we will add a for each activity. To get all the files in the Invoices folder, we'll need to write the following statement and the file path of the folder. At this moment, the items are stored as objects, but we will need to change the for each argument to a string because we'll use the file name. Next, we'll create a new variable, which will be a file type. We'll use an assign activity and press Ctrl+K to create the new variable. Let's call it file. This variable will be a file info of every item that we get from the directory. As you can see, we have an error which states that we need to change file to system.io.fileinfo. To solve this, let's go to the variable panel, select our sequence, browse for types, and search for our data type, system.io.file. Perfect. Now that we have the information about our file, we'll need to get the file name, and for that, we'll use a second assign activity and create a new variable called file name. Let's set the type to string. To get the file name, we'll use the following expression, file.name.split. We'll split the string after the dot, which is a character. The split method will create two substrings, one before the dot and one after the dot. To get the file name, we'll need to get the first string, which will be at index 0 of the new substring array. At this point, we have the file name, which, for the first item, is invoice1_2015, saved to the file name variable. Next, it's time to use our switch. We will use it to send the files to the correct folder, based on the last 4 characters of the substring that we've just extracted. We'll start by checking which year is present in our file name. To do that, let's get our file name and use the substring method to check the last 4 characters in our string. We'll use filename.length-4. Notice the error that we're getting. This is because we need to change the type argument from int32 to the type that we are using, string. Great. Next, we'll set the behavior for the cases. We'll start with the default case, the one where we don't find anything, and then set a different case for each year. For the default case, let's add a message box stating no file was found. For each of the other cases, we'll set the value of the substring in the case value input field and add a move file activity to move the invoice to the designated folder. It's important to remember that the case input field is the only place where strings are not written between quotation marks. Next, we'll need the full path of our existing invoice. Let's enter file.fullname in the path input field. As you can see, file.fullname is different from file.name. File.fullname contains the full path, where file.name contains only the short name of the file. Now, all we need to do is to add the destination folder. To do so, we can go back to the folder, copy the path, and paste it in the destination input field. Next, we will need to create a case for each other type of invoice that we have. Copy the move file activity and change the destination folder. Last but not least, let's not forget about best practices. We need to change our assign names and add annotations. Let's add an annotation in the switch to explain our expression. And let's add an annotation to the first move file activity. It's time to see what we've got. Let's run our process. And let's check the folders. As you can see, the invoices folder is now empty, and we have the 4 folders containing the invoices with the same year as the folder name. And this is how you build a switch in a sequence project. It's good to know that we can also use switches in flowchart workflows. The activity that we need to add is called flow switch. Let's create a new flowchart and call it flowchart switch. we'll copy an example that we've already prepared, so we can compare the structure. As you can see, this workflow follows the same logic as the sequence. The flow switch is right here, with its default case and its message box, and the other 4 cases connected to the move file activities. As a general practice, we recommend using a sequence as it's easier to read and implement. And that's all for this lesson. Thank you for watching.